Hey guys, we have made it officially. It is Luke week 6, and we are in Luke chapter 4, and we're looking at verses 14 through 30 today. And so I really am excited to dig into this with you guys, and we're just going to jump right in and pray towards the end of the conversation. So one of the things, as I was reading this chapter of Luke, one of the things that jumped out to me right away was how it starts. So if we want to go to verse 14, so Luke chapter 4, verse 14, it says, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. So Jesus is riding high. He is preaching in the synagogues. People know his name. Word about him is spreading everywhere. Scripture says everyone is praising him. So right now, in worldly terms, Jesus is doing everything right. Right now, I feel like in our social media obsessed world and in our media obsessed world, period, people want praise, they want affirmation, they want likes and followers. You know, even Christian writers and speakers, they look for a following. They look to build their platform. And building a platform is where Jesus was at. He had a platform. Everyone in his region of Galilee knew him. And to just tell you guys what that means, there was about 3 million people living in the region of Galilee at that time. And Galilee means circle. So it was the top part of Israel, and it was kind of circular. It was the least conservative part of the country. There was about 204 villages or towns, and it was super fertile. There was a lot of growth and agriculture. And so 3 million people in the region of Galilee is nothing to sneeze at, even in 2020. So, you know, Jesus, right now, if he had a YouTube channel, he'd be riding high. If he had an Instagram account, Jesus is killing it with his followers. He's got his platform. And so Jesus right now, he is where the world would say he wants to be. So what does he do? The first thing he does when he has this platform, he's speaking in churches and synagogues, and everyone's speaking well of him, he goes home. He goes to the town of Nazareth. And in Nazareth, it continues on to where it says in verse 16, he went to Nazareth where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, he went to the synagogue, and he starts to teach at the synagogue. And just so you guys know too, the synagogue in that tradition, in that time frame, they had 3 parts to their worship service. So their first part was a worship kind of session, like a little bit like what we do now with music, but they did it with prayer. And so they would have prayer that would be chanted or recited. And then the second part would be readings from the scriptures. There would be 1 to 7 people that would be invited to read from the scripture. And then after the scripture is read, any distinguished person in the congregation could get up and share a word about the readings that have been read. So Jesus, he comes into the synagogue, he stands up to read, and what does he read? Let's look at it. I'm just gonna grab my Bible. He says in verse 18, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then it says he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. So Jesus, at the height of popularity, with everything going for him the way in worldly terms it should go, he chooses to go home. He chooses to open a scripture that speaks specifically to his calling. And then he sits down and says, and this is it. He says, I am here. The Spirit of the Lord is on me. I am anointed, and I'm going to the poor, to the prisoners, to the blind, and to the oppressed. That's amazing. When I think about our God and his heart, our God and his desire for us, that is who he's going to. Jesus is not going to the wealthy, the well-received, the popular. He's not going to the righteous or the better ones in society. He's going to the ones that society thinks are throw out or castaways or not worth anything. And he says, today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And so verse 22 continues, and it says, All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they said. And so Jesus is still, even after revealing his calling and his motivation to them, he's still being well received. They are in a good mood. They are tracking with him. They, at this point, think he might be the Messiah, which remember we talked about Rome and the different rulers of the time frame. So they're thinking in terms of freedom from Rome. They're thinking political freedom here. So they're very receptive to this idea, especially as he probably is talking about prisoners in captivity. And so he continues on and he starts to unpack what this means for them, the prisoner and the oppressed that he's going to. And we're going to see a really drastic change in the hearts of the people listening. So let's continue reading. Verse 23, Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' And you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum.' Truly I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his own hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine in the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." And then verse 28, all the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. So what is Jesus saying here? What changes from when he reads Isaiah and everyone is tracking and excited and happy to a few sentences later and everyone has gone from happy to furious and actually to wanting to kill him? Well, what he's referencing is that the prophets that they revere, Elijah and Elisha, who are major players in Jewish history and tradition, he's referencing that God sent them to Gentiles. He sent Elijah to a Gentile widow, and he sent Elisha to a Gentile soldier. And you have to understand that Jewish people believed very deeply in their chosenness for God. That was it's part of their story and their tradition and their history. And they believe that they are the special chosen people. And then because of that, their belief turned out towards everyone who's not a Jew as if they were less than. So everyone who's not a Jew then became literally fuel for the fires of hell. So there's a lot of tones to this. There are racial tones, there are political tones, there are religious tones. And so Jesus is not just poking at them with their belief system with a stick, he's demolishing it. He's saying two things. He's saying, my calling is to go to the oppressed, the poor, the captive, and the blind. And he's saying, and those people that I'm going to go set free are not necessarily the people, the chosen ones. They are the Gentiles. They are the ones that you consider to be less than. And so it's really literally throwing every part of their belief system off course. And I think that's so interesting because Jesus did not care about his popularity, his praise, or his platform. Jesus was interested in two things. He was interested in fulfilling the calling that the Father had given him, and he was interested in upsetting the religious dynamic that was unhealthy and that was unkind and that was narrow-minded. And he wanted to open that and challenge them and say that God has created all people. He loves all people, and that no one person is more important than the other. And so immediately that rage rises up and they take him, the scripture says, they take him to the end of the town and they try to throw Christ off a cliff, and he just walks away from them. So here's where I wanted to stop and breathe with you guys for a minute and consider this, because we've gone on a journey in just a few short paragraphs. We've gone from Jesus being super popular, Jesus having all of the praise and all of the momentum that he could want, revealing his calling, challenging the people who are following him. And then there's this huge quick shift in public perception. And he goes from being praised to being almost murdered. But in that, there's a moment of choice. So between the praise and the murder moment, we're going to call it a murder moment, there's a moment of choice where Jesus reveals his calling, and then he could have chosen to soften it. He could have chosen to say what the people wanted to hear. But instead of feeding the crowd and feeding their egos, he fed them truth. He fed them truth. And he stayed true to his calling. He stayed true to what the Father had given him to do. And you'll see that in the story of Christ over and over again in the Gospel of Luke, that he challenges the religious status quo, and he challenges people's conceptions and biases and their ideas, and he invites them into a bigger picture, and he invites them into a more loving, more holy way of life. And so my challenge for us today, you guys, is where are we at personally? Are we chasing popularity? Are we chasing the status quo? Are we looking for people to like us and be happy with us? Are we willing to follow our calling? Because the calling of Jesus is the calling of the church. There's no messing around with that. There's no trying to deny it. The calling of Christ is the calling of the church, and we're called as well to the poor, to the oppressed, to the blind, and the captive, to set them free. Whether that blind captive person is your worst enemy, or whether that blind captive person is someone you have never known or understood from a different culture than you, we are called to the whole world. We're called to our neighborhood, we're called to our country, we're called to the world. And no one is excluded from the call or the love of God. Jesus was very, very clear about that. So as you guys are going to your groups, as you guys are getting ready to talk about the questions that you have in front of you, that's just my challenge today. Jesus had a moment of choice, and we're going to have choices. And so are we willing to give up the popularity and the praise and to step into discomfort to follow the call that God has given to us as Christ followers? I love you guys. It's been great going through Luke with you, and I hope that you have gotten as much out of it, honestly, as I have. It's been really good. So, bye.